I'd like to welcome everybody to the second panel of our program. It's a panel on the latest book from Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn. The book is titled The Founder's Key, The Divine and Natural Connection Between the Declaration and the Constitution and What We Risk by Losing It. My name is R.J. Pestritto. I am a professor of politics and graduate dean at the college, and again, welcome. One of the things we talk about a great deal in the politics program at the college is the classical notion of practical wisdom or prudence that was considered central to the art of statesmanship. And I think it's in the spirit of prudence that I am going to refrain from opining myself on the book written by the man who signs my paychecks. We have instead a distinguished panel here to handle that job this morning. Before introducing them, I will take just a couple of minutes to acquaint our audience with the book's central argument. In The Founder's Key, Larry Arnn articulates the principles of the American Declaration of Independence, and he contends that these principles cannot be understood in isolation. Rather, he explains that in writing the Declaration, its authors also outlined the essential qualities of the government that would be necessary to uphold the Declaration's objectives of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution of the United States, Arnn argues, was the requisite means of answering the Declaration's exhortation to secure man's natural rights. And he contends, contrary to some scholars on both the left and the right, that the founders themselves saw no disconnect between the argument of the Declaration and the Constitution. At bottom, the connection between the two documents is this: the Declaration establishes government by consent as the only form of just government, and the Constitution's limited representative government, organized around the separation of powers, is the only government fit for the consent of free men. Among other places, Arnn finds the foundation for the Constitution in the Declaration's list of grievances against King George III. These grievances, which point to deficiencies in consent, representation, limited government, separation of powers, these grievances form then the framework of the American Constitution. It will not be surprising that Arnn's book takes on critics from the left, who for over 100 years have sought to undo the principles of the Declaration and the limited government framework of the Constitution. What may not be as well known is that Arnn's argument also has its share of critics on the right. Some there, in the spirit of the Anti-Federalists, still see the Constitution as a betrayal of the principles of the Revolution and as a turning away from genuine republicanism for an embrace of nationalism or empire. Others on the right are highly suspicious of the Declaration itself, recoiling from what they think are its philosophic antecedents, or seeing in it the same kind of dangerous abstractions that make all good conservatives loathe the French Revolution. For these critics, any movement in the Constitution away from the Declaration is in fact a good thing. I suspect our panelists may weigh in on some of these debates, so I will give way to them. Let me give you just a short introduction to each here at the outset in the order in which they will speak. First will be Randy Barnett. Randy Barnett is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Legal Theory at Georgetown University Law Center. He teaches there constitutional law and contracts. After graduating from Northwestern University and Harvard Law School, he tried many felony cases as a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in Chicago. He's been a visiting professor at Northwestern and Harvard Law School. In 2008, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in Constitutional Studies. Professor Barnett's publications include more than 100 articles and reviews, as well as 9 books, including Restoring the Lost Constitution, The Presumption of Liberty. Next will be Patrick Deneen. Patrick Dineen is the Frank Potenziani Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches political theory. From 2005 through May of 2012, he served as Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University, where he was the founding director of the Tocqueville Forum on the Roots of American Democracy. Before that, he taught at Princeton University from 1997 to 2005 as an Assistant Professor of Government. From 1995 to 1997, he was speechwriter and special advisor to the director of the United States Information Agency. Professor Dineen received his BA and PhD from Rutgers University, where he studied with the late Wilson Carey McWilliams, and he's the author of two books, The Odyssey of Political Theory and Democratic Faith. Finishing out our panel will be Dr. Larry Arnn. Larry Arnn is the 12th president of Hillsdale College. He received his BA from Arkansas State University, graduating with the highest distinction. He received his MA in government and his PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School. He also studied in England, first as a research student in international history at the London School of Economics, and then in modern history at Worcester College, Oxford University. While in England, he also served as Director of Research for Martin Gilbert, now Sir Martin, of Merton College, Oxford, and the official biographer of Winston Churchill. He returned to the United States, and from 1985 to 2000, he served as president of the Claremont Institute. Dr. Arnn is on the board of directors of the Heritage Foundation, the Henry Salvatori Center of Claremont McKenna College, and the Claremont Institute. He is author of Liberty and Learning, The Evolution of American Education, published in 2004. His newest book, The Founder's Key, is, of course, the subject of this panel. So without any further ado, we will go to Professor Barnett.
Well, thank you, RJ, and thanks to Hillsdale for inviting me to be on this forum. I believe this is the first time that I've participated in an official Hillsdale program. I'm a huge fan of Hillsdale College, and to paraphrase Claude Rains in Casablanca, I hope this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And also, let me congratulate Larry on his wonderful new book. It's a marvelous book. As Blaise Pascal is reputed to have written, I've made this letter longer than usual because I lack the time to make it shorter. This book must have taken a long time to write because it is powerfully concise. Its basic message is a vitally important one. The Constitution must be interpreted with the Declaration of Independence in mind. In my brief remarks today, I'm going to explain why I think this is the case, and in fact, it's how I teach my constitutional law course at Georgetown. Now, I began my career as a law professor, not as a constitutional law scholar, but as a contracts professor. Part of the reason for that was when I took constitutional law at Harvard when I was a student, I discovered that every time we got to one of the good parts in the Constitution, the Supreme Court said it didn't mean anything and we shouldn't pay any attention to it. So I thought to myself, well, if they don't pay any attention to the Constitution, why should I? If I'm going to go into teaching, I'm going to teach about something where they do pay attention to the law and to writings, and contract law was what I chose. Little did I know I was going to end up as a constitutional law professor after all of that. But there is an important lesson I learned as a contracts professor, and that is that all writings are incomplete. All writings are inevitably incomplete. That's one of the reasons why we have problems. That's why there's contract law cases about contracts. Now, this is due to a variety of factors. One is the inadequacy of time to fully negotiate everything in a contract. Secondly, an inadequate knowledge of the future. You just don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. Unexpected things arise that you didn't anticipate. Thirdly, sort of an underlooked factor, if you keep bargaining about something endlessly to try to cover all contingencies, eventually the other side's going to look at you and you're going to say, this is not exactly the sort of person I want to do business with. This guy won't stop bargaining with me, and what about this, and what about that, what about this? No, okay, fine, you go, I'm going to find someone else. So at some point, you just stop bargaining and you stop writing and you can't put everything in there. And then there's a final reason why contracts or all writings are incomplete, and that is that there are some things that are so fundamental that they go without saying. It's almost insulting to put something in a writing. Like you agree to be honest with me. You agree not to lie. Things like that. I mean, why would you put that in there? Of course, that just goes without saying. So it turns out that with respect to the American Constitution, which is a writing, there are two fundamental assumptions that aren't clearly expressed in the Constitution itself, although I think that they are fairly implied. And the first is one I'm not going to spend much time on, although Larry does talk about it in his book, and that is that the Articles of Confederation are simply not working well and need to be replaced. And Madison wrote a whole wonderful essay that Larry talks about called The Vices of the Articles of Confederation, which explains exactly, chapter and verse, what's the problem and why the Articles are the source of that problem. It's not really what I'm going to talk about here. The second fundamental assumption, and by the way, that was not an assumption that everyone in the country shared. It was shared by enough people to eventually get the Constitution ratified, but it was a contested assumption underlying the Constitution. The next assumption was universally shared by everyone in the country, and that is that government is meant to secure our natural rights. And if you want a sort of a shorthand phrase for what this slogan was, or for what this position was that everybody assumed, and that is first comes rights, and then comes government. First comes rights, and then comes government, was a fundamental assumption that everyone agreed with, whether they were for the Constitution or against it. So when we talk about the relationship of the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution, one of the most important things about the Declaration of Independence is that it makes its definitive evidence of this second assumption. It is an official written record of the fact that the founding generation shared this assumption. It tells us that the foundation of the Revolution and of all just governments was first comes rights and then comes government. The most famous line in the Declaration is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That is the most famous sentence in the Declaration, and unfortunately, most people don't read much more than that. But the next sentence in the Declaration expresses the relationship between these rights and government. And the next sentence is extremely important as well. It says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Let me just say that again. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Today, when democracy is conceived of as majority rule, most of the stress is placed on the last part of this sentence, referring to the consent of the governed, and I have to say that that is how RJ's summary of the book placed it. His description of the thesis of the book was, you have the consent of the governed, and the Constitution is the way you execute the consent of the governed, and that's the relationship of the Declaration to the Constitution. I don't really agree. I mean, that's part of it, but I don't agree with that being the thrust of it, and I don't think it was the thrust of Larry's book either. I think the thrust of Larry's book is really unpacking the first part of that sentence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted. It tells us, this sentence does, that this part of this, that these pre-existing natural rights are the proper end of all legitimate government, not just here, but everywhere. And that these natural rights provide the criteria by which the legitimacy of government is to be judged. In other words, these natural rights do not go away once government is founded, as some, I think, moderns tend to think that they do, including modern conservatives tend to think that they do. The Declaration is evidence of that, for after all, it was the long train of abuse of those rights that justified Americans, quote, to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. In other words, notwithstanding the fact that government was created and Americans were in a civil society with each other and with the people of Great Britain, notwithstanding all of that, because of the long train of abuses of their natural rights, of the rights that still existed even though government was formed, they had the rightful power to disassociate themselves with the political community that they formerly were associated with, withdraw from that and form their own, as a result of the fact that their natural rights had been violated. So they don't go away once government is founded, and they don't go away once this government is founded. So the relationship of these two documents, then, I think is rather clear and elegant. The written Declaration of Independence brilliantly and movingly describes the end of all legitimate government, that is, to secure these natural rights. While the written Constitution describes the means to that end. The Articles of Confederation was a means to that end, but it wasn't, at least according to those who adopted the Constitution, an adequate one. And we could do better, and they did do better, I think in many respects, by adopting the Constitution as the means to the end of securing those rights. That is the fundamental relationship of the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution. Now, when I teach all this on the first day of my constitutional law class at Georgetown, which I did this semester, I have to spend time explaining to my students what the heck natural rights are, since this is not the part of any of their education unless they went to Hillsdale College. The first thing I have to do, I have to say to convince them of the plausibility of the idea of natural rights, is to point out that all of them, or many of them, if they're right-thinking people, right-thinking in the sense of progressive, they all believe in what they call human rights. Human rights are something, what are human rights? What do they think human rights are? They think they're the things that governments can violate if they torture, if they do this, if they do that, but that they are independent of government and are a criteria by which you assess government. And since they believe in human rights, they themselves believe that first comes rights and then comes government, even if we may disagree about what they are. But it's less mysterious if they realize they themselves invoke the idea, and they haven't moved completely beyond it. The second thing that I have to say is that natural rights are not really any more mysterious than the principles that are discovered in such disciplines as agriculture, engineering, and medicine. Now, unlike the descriptive disciplines of, say, physics or biology, which merely try to describe or explain the world as we know it, these other disciplines I just listed, agriculture, engineering, and medicine, are what we might call normative disciplines. By that I mean they are designed to instruct human beings in how to act. They are there to tell you what to do under certain circumstances, how to act under certain circumstances. So, for example, if you want to grow crops for human consumption, build buildings for human occupancy, and make sick human beings well, then you would best follow the basic principles or precepts of these disciplines, of these normative disciplines. And these principles, when people hear about natural rights, they say, well, wait, where are these natural rights? Tell me where they are. I mean, are they in the dirt? Are they in the sky? I don't see them. Where are they? Well, we don't say that about principles of medicine, engineering, and agriculture, do we? We don't say, well, you know where you're going to find those principles of agriculture? In the dirt. Go look in the dirt. You'll see how to grow crops. You know where you're going to find the principles of medicine? Just undo the body, cut open the body. You'll see the principles. No. Of course, these are human constructions, human concepts meant to solve problems on the basis of what? On the basis of the nature of soil and nutrients and the things that grow in them, on the basis the nature of the body. When it comes to engineering, the nature of the properties of the various things that go into making up these buildings. These are all based on the nature of the world we find themselves. If you want to accomplish certain ends, you had best respect these means in order to accomplish those ends. Natural rights can simply be recharacterized, and they were, in fact, at the time recharacterized as simply principles of society. These are the fundamental principles of society. If you want a society in which people can pursue happiness while enjoying peace and prosperity, then you had best respect these basic fundamental natural rights. That's all it is. It's no more mysterious than these other principles. So here's a rough and ready test, empirical test of how different societies do in protecting basic natural rights. Because if the claim is right, if natural rights in fact are the principles of society by which you can achieve happiness, peace, and prosperity, then there would be an empirical test or an empirical result or outcome of violating those rights. Here's a rough and ready empirical test. See which way the refugees are running. See which countries they're leaving, trying to get out of, and which countries they're trying to get into. It's a comparative test. It doesn't mean the place they're trying to get into is a perfect respecter of natural rights, only that they're doing a better job of it. And again, there's other confounding variables. For example, welfare policies can attract people to a country even if that's not a subject of natural rights. But nevertheless, it is still a very good indicator when people are trying to, when you put up a wall, are you trying to keep the people out or are you trying to keep the people in? That's sort of an empirical test. Okay, so finally, maybe not finally, almost finally, what are these natural rights? Obviously, that's the $64,000 question. I'm not going to be able to answer that in a few minutes, but let me give you a basic conclusion and some reasons for understanding that. Put simply, they are liberty rights. Natural rights are liberty rights. They're not the only rights we have, and they are not the only rights we need. We need other rights, rights that are the creation of government. You form government to create additional rights, like, for example, the right of protection. I'll say more about that in a second. But natural rights are the rights you start with. Natural rights are the rights you have before you have a government. They are liberty rights, but not liberty in the Hobbesian sense of doing anything you will or desire. That's not the kind of liberty rights they are. That's not the kind of liberty rights, for example, that libertarians believe in, Hobbesian liberty rights. No, the founders believe in liberty rights in the Lockean sense. And that is, the liberty is the freedom to do what you will with what's yours. It's the freedom to do what you will with what's yours. Think of it this way. Every individual is a sovereign ruler of all within his or her jurisdiction. Private property defines the boundaries of each of our jurisdictions within which we are supposed to be the sovereign. We are supposed to be the king. Properly defined property rights eliminate conflicts among the jurisdictions of the sovereign citizens. As Larry writes in his book, nothing properly called a right takes anything from anyone else. That's something you can only really say about a liberty right. The Declaration tells us that the first and highest duty of government is to protect these rights. In fact, it ends up getting put into the 14th Amendment as the Equal Protection Clause. It is the duty of the states to protect the rights of the citizens. As Locke taught, it is better to secure better secure these rights that we move from a state of nature where each of us must enforce or execute them on our own behalf to delegate the executive power of enforcement to the government. That's the rationale for setting up government in the first place. Government must make us better off by better protecting our rights than we can protect them ourselves. But this means that governments that systematically fail to protect or even violate these rights are not fulfilling their reason for existence and therefore can be illegitimate. What the exact conditions are of illegitimacy, I'm going to bracket that for a moment, because an individual rights violation is not enough to render a whole government illegitimate. In fact, the Declaration teaches us that it's a long train of abuses that justifies replacing one government with another. The founders knew all this and designed a constitution to secure these rights, if we follow it, and sadly, we have not. But the Constitution, I should say, we have not followed all of it. As I already mentioned, that's what I learned when I was in constitutional law. But the Constitution was so well designed that even though whole portions of it are misconstrued or completely ignored, and the ignored parts are what my book is about, it's called Restoring the Lost Constitution. What I mean by the lost Constitution is not a good old days when constitutional law was great. It's the parts of the Constitution that are gone and that are not there anymore. That's the lost Constitution. The Constitution was so well designed that even with large parts of it missing, the parts that remain have still kept us relatively free. It's like flying in a well-designed four-engine jet after 3 of the engines have failed. Because the plane is well-designed, it can still stay aloft with one engine, but it's a far more vulnerable and precarious state to try to do that than to fly on all 4 engines. What we need to do constitutionally in this country is get the other 3 engines fired up. But to do this, we first need to appreciate that the end of government and the purpose that underlies the Constitution, a purpose so fundamental that it largely went without saying in the Constitution itself. The Declaration of Independence stands as a written, official, and moving testimony to this underlying assumption. Larry Arnn's book is a beautifully written and mercifully concise explanation of this relationship, which makes it a vital tool to restoring our lost Constitution, and for this, I thank him.
Well, I too want to begin by thanking Hillsdale College. I realize I also have never appeared in an official capacity, although I know many of the faculty at Hillsdale for many years, including its provost, David Whalen. I suppose, though, unlike Professor Barnett, my role here is to lodge some objections, and so I won't expect an invitation back as much as I would like one. But before I raise some concerns about the argument of Dr. Arnn's book, and I think they were well telegraphed by R.J. Pestritto, so I'm brought in to criticize from the right to show that there's an even more dangerous form of right-wingerism than that which is portrayed out there today in the popular media. But I too would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Arnn for this book, for its seriousness, for its sustained attention and its probing exploration of the vital relationship of the principles underlying the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, of their relationship, and I think further, the relationship that they both bear to the world that in some respects they created. And that's something about what I want to talk about. In this way, Dr. Arnn is not only speaking about the Constitution, that document
that we can read and interpret. But I think he's evoking a more ancient understanding of constitution, a constitution, as Aristotle describes it, that builds a way of life, sometimes translated as regime. I don't mean this in the Rush Limbaugh sense, but rather that fosters a kind of way of living. In fact, on page 4, Dr. Arnn writes that the way that we talk, the way that we stand, the way that we dance or sing, all are influenced by the laws of the land and the principles behind them, and our laws and principles spring from these laws and these documents. And I think anyone who's traveled abroad and has encountered another American, no matter in some ways where they're from, you immediately sense these are one of my people. There is something really palpable and recognizable about being a part of the American regime that goes beyond simply, oh, we have that Constitution. It builds a way of life. But this very claim, and I think it's a central claim, and I think it's a correct claim, that the Constitution, the Declaration, and its underlying principles establish a regime, a way of life, actually stands as a challenge to the overarching thesis of Dr. Arnn's book, and not only Dr. Arnn's book, but a narrative that a number of my friends and many estimable authors have developed over the last number of years, including the lunch speaker today, Dr. Kessler, Dr. Pestritto, and I think popularized in some of the columns of George Will, and even in the television programming of Glenn Beck back when he had a television show. This thesis, and I don't mean to be reductionist, but I don't have a lot of time, suggests that for much of human history, there was a continuity in the main claims about what it is to be a human under law that begin to be articulated in antiquity by some of the authors like Plato and Aristotle and then Cicero, continue to be articulated through the Christian era, through the Middle Ages, and then into early modern times. The founding, the American founding, and one of the reasons it's exceptional, that word we hear a lot about today, is that the founding represents the practical culmination and realization of this long history of the development of a set of ideas, which had been until that time merely theory, but which, because of a concatenation of happy events, pilgrims coming over, the revolution, a kind of practice of representative government, only America, for the first time in world history, was able to realize in fact. However, there's a downside and a sad side to this narrative that only 100 years later, after this 1,000 years building, or more than 1,000 years building of this tradition and then the culmination in the founding of America, 100 years later, beginning at the end of the 19th and then the beginning of the 20th centuries, that entire tradition is, if not overturned, severely challenged and put under duress by the introduction of what's broadly called historicism, or what we today call progressivism, right? Which in fact the Democratic Party now is called progressivism. Moreover, progressivism is a foreign import. It's like a BMW. It comes from Germany. It comes especially from elite thinkers in America who go to study with a number of German thinkers who believe that history is in some ways takes a progressive course. And so that we must look with a kind of an understanding of the past that we are always superior to those who have preceded us. From whence comes the elitism of progressives? Well, that which has preceded us, the past, is always inferior to that which has followed it. So history not only has a direction, but a direction always toward greater progress. So within 100 years, the work of the founders and the culmination of centuries of philosophical work comes undone and continues to be undone until this day. Now, in a nutshell, this thesis, while I've stated it crudely, while I think it is a very useful one, and I think it is politically useful, I find it, in fact, as perhaps an intellectual, to be highly implausible. I find it to be highly implausible, among other things, because it seems to me such a solid foundation, something that builds a way of life, would have a lasting power for more than merely a century. And what I'd like to do today is to offer an alternative thesis, and one that is disconcerting to those of us who are friends to the Constitution, at least to some extent, but worry about whether or not in some ways it is in some ways complicit, and the belief that I think was well articulated by Dr. Barnett, that the belief it engenders in some ways contributes to our current condition, is not simply a contradiction of our current condition. In my narrative, then, the founding represents not the continuity and culmination of a long tradition, but a rupture that arose especially at the beginnings. I mean, it had a long period of time developing, but the currents especially arising from the Protestant Reformation, a decisive break with antiquity, and that America is the first regime founded on specifically a set of modern principles, ones derived in the first instance from Machiavelli, from Hobbes and Locke. I'm a political theorist. This is modern for me. The Renaissance is really modern. And I further want to suggest that rather than progressivism being a rupture, that in many ways progressivism grew out of the soil of this rupture that is introduced by the American founding, that there's more continuity than tends to be noticed between progressives and constitutionalists than we tend to notice in our current contemporary political debates. So let me just offer in very brief the two reasons why I hold this view. First, that the founding represents a break with antiquity. And I'm actually going to use many of the same phrases and sentences as proof of my argument that Dr. Arnn uses in support of his argument. As Alexander Hamilton notes in the very first of the Federalist Papers, he writes, "It has frequently been remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide by their conduct and example whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever forced to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." In a subsequent paper, he notes advances in the science of politics, ones that render all previous regimes illegitimate in comparison to the principles that have been established and embraced in America, and those principles that have been derived from the Constitution and from the Declaration. Those principles break with the ancient tradition, I want to suggest, in the following ways, not only as has been suggested by Professor Barnett, but in the following ways. First, there's an argument that political society must and cannot but be based upon the fundamental wellspring of self-interest. This is the only reliable wellspring that can be, in some ways, predictably relied upon and expected in the course of human affairs. But this represents a major break with the ancient and the Christian tradition, which argued for the educability of the human soul. Argued, in fact, for the possibility of the education of the human being and the citizenry in virtue. And that this took place, in particular, on smaller scales, ideally. And why, in the ancient Republican tradition, there was a stress on locality, on smallness, as opposed to greatness. Madison, in addressing some of these fundamental questions about what is the nature of the human being and are we educable, asked a famous question, again quoted by Dr. Arnn, and many of you may perhaps know this quote. "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary." That is, he's suggesting, Madison is suggesting in Federalist 51, if humans were naturally good, there would be no need for government, no need for law. Right? We would just be naturally good. We wouldn't have to have a government. But human beings are not naturally good. We are naturally prone to self-interest, to self-aggrandizement, to pride, to sin. We inescapably do ill to others. We are inescapably driven by our self-interest. And why Madison argues that when we establish the government, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. We won't seek the reduction of harmful ambition. We will seek to counteract its presence. We will harness self-interest. We won't seek to overcome it. Elsewhere in Federalist 10, he famously articulates that moral and religious motives cannot be relied upon. Right? We can't rely on them in the same way that we can rely on self-interest as a basic motivation in politics. But I want you to notice, I'll say it, the outright blasphemy of Madison's suggestion. I used to teach at Princeton, so I think he learned this at Princeton. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Well, as far as I can understand by my reading of Scripture and other documents, the angels are under government. They're under a kind of tyrannical government, in fact. They're under a monarch. And we could point out, among other things, that they're not always good. Lucifer was kind of a problematic angel. who seem not to have obeyed the government, the law. But I think what's more important, and what Madison doesn't notice because of his fundamental assumptions about human nature, government, and human motivation, is that government only exists to prevent ill, to prevent evil. But in the angelic and divine understanding, government, God's government, exists in some ways because of the natural order of things. Among other things, not natural rights, but natural law. Right? It's built into the fabric of the world that certain things are right and just and certain things are not. And whether one is naturally good or not, government exists in some ways as a natural expression of that order. This is why John Milton portrays Satan, portrays the fallen angel Lucifer, as desiring liberty, which he believes is the capacity to escape from the law. His ideal understanding of liberty is the capacity to escape from the law. But we discover that the truly free angel is Michael, because Michael submits himself to the law, and in this submission discovers his liberty. His liberty is to be in accordance with the divine law. I think this basic understanding and this admission by Madison suggests that for Madison, the soul is ineducable. We are always and fundamentally driven by self-interest, and all that government in some ways can do is prevent us from doing harm to each other, but it can't in some ways leaven the ground and the world for the cultivation of virtue. And when I look around our world today and trying to raise my children in a world where there's very little evidence of virtue in our culture, I find myself longing for a time and longing even for the capacity of our public world to help foster that kind of a ground. The best way in which this teaching of Madison's is to be achieved is to enlarge the scale of the government. Not the government, I'm sorry, to enlarge the scale of the nation and to increase the size, the majesty, and the might of the nation. But it's admitted throughout the Federalist Papers that this will come at the expense of identification with the local. As Hamilton writes in Federalist 17, it is a known fact in human nature that human affections are commonly weak in proportion to the distance of the diffusiveness of the object, how far away something is. The people of each state are apt to feel a stronger bias toward their local governments than toward the government of the Union, unless, he writes, the force of that principle should be destroyed by a much larger administration of the latter. So he admits an exception to this normal default understanding of human beings that we prefer the local over the national, except if the central government is better administered. And then 10 papers later in number 27, he says that because the government will draw, as he states, a select body of men, it will induce a probability that the general government, the central government, will be better administered than the particular governments. So he acknowledges that the proviso, the exception, will likely come to pass. And again, when I read this morning's newspapers that 7 of the country's 10 most wealthiest counties are in the D.C. area, it does strike me how this center has just increasingly drawn all of the talent and the wealth of the country to this place. And this is perhaps not as much in contradiction to Hamilton's vision as we might suppose. I've spoke probably at too much length. Let me just speak very briefly to why I think that this basic set of assumptions lead to ground that becomes fertile for the movement of progressivism. First, and drawing out of that last point that I made, there is shared by many of the founders, as well as progressives, a kind of hostility to local culture, what one might call the genius of place. An orientation toward liberation from the particular, from the cultural, from the traditional. As Dr. Arnn suggests in reading the Declaration, I quote, it hardly reads like a document from any particular world at all. It's written for every human, but not for people in particular cultures and places. There was no less a valorization of progress among the founding generation as one finds among the progressives. And I could provide for you many quotes and pieces of evidence. But I think from the very beginning of the American project, a strong emphasis upon progress as the basic orientation and wellspring, which from the very beginning, as I indicated in that quote of Hamilton, already puts under suspicion that which has preceded. right? The same indictment that is made against today's progressives. They don't respect that which happened in the past. Well, what is Hamilton doing in Federalist 1 but dismissing everything that has happened in the past and saying, we, for the first time, have done these things? And lastly, an interesting and perhaps inescapable relationship between the anthropological individualism, the Lockean assumptions of natural rights that lies at the heart of the Declaration and the Constitution, that relates it ultimately to a kind of anthropological collectivism. And I think that the author here, and someone that hasn't been mentioned yet and is only, I think, mentioned once in Dr. Arnn's book, but since I used to lead a program, or I founded a program at Georgetown by this name, the author I think that teaches us best about this is Alexis de Tocqueville. And what Tocqueville saw, and I think foresaw, was a time when, in the effort to escape from place, from locality, from tradition, from culture, in order to become and to fulfill the vision of liberty that was in some ways held out in the imaginings of the early philosophy that in some ways culminates in our tradition, that very liberation would leave us increasingly alone, bereft of help and assistance, and we would turn increasingly to the one body, the one place that could afford us assistance, and which he describes as the vast and tutelary state. The vast and tutelary state, he says, arises not from a collectivist impulse, but in the first instance, out of a kind of a rampant individualism that leaves us bereft of help, leaves us bereft of the assistance of entities that are subnational. And so for those of us who care deeply about the fate of this country, for those of us who share, I think, Dr. Arnn's deep commitments to limited government, deep commitments to a government that is not simply attempting to govern all of our behavior and all of our actions, I would hope that Hillsdale College, the Kirby Center, will stress as much not only the need to restore the Constitution, which seems to me is a necessary but insufficient condition, but like Tocqueville, stress those sub-national entities, the health of our families, the solidity and stability of our communities, the central role of our churches, our religious institutions, that area of civil society that ought to flourish in some ways in spite of, in many ways, what might be happening in Washington, D.C. I've left Washington in part because I wanted to leave Washington, not only physically, but to leave it behind and to care more for what's closer than what's far away. So I thank you.
So it's obviously an absurd thing for a fellow like me to write a book. The sad truth is my book is short because I didn't have time to write a long one. Randy got it exactly backwards. And I have placed myself at the mercy of highly intelligent and even brilliant and learned people. And they've been kind to me, but of course they have enormous advantages over me because I do spend so very much of my time managing things like organizing to sign R.J. Pestritto's paycheck. When they called me about this job 12 years ago, I actually laughed at them. It's the third time I'd been called about a college president job, and all three times I laughed at them, and I said, I don't want that job. That's a terrible job. And they said, why? And I said, most of my friends are faculty members. I know what they think about college presidents. And sure enough, from these two guys, my introduction began with one of them mentioning that I have some authority over him, and the other one the other one ended by mentioning a policy he recommends me to implement here at Hillsdale College and in the Kirby Center. I point all that out, and while I do that, I thank these three because of their quality and the goodness they've shown. I thank Randy because, Lord, has he not done wonderful service to our country lately, but also in addition, he has been, although he hardly knows it, I mentioned it to him one time, a teacher of mine now for more than a decade. Because I learned a long time ago, like the first thing he taught me is something he wrote probably 400 years ago about what the necessary and proper clause means. And I was having a fight with somebody about that, and I went looking, and I found something he wrote, and I didn't know who he was at the time. And I said, boy, this guy's good. And so now commonly, I go look for him when I'm trying to settle something, and to have him here today is a great honor and pleasure. Professor Dineen is a defender of things that I very much love, and an able and distinguished defender of them. He has taught in fine places, a very fine place right now. Unlike him, I have the honor never to have lived in this city, but he recovered, and he's gone now. But he's a faithful and kind and studious man and highly intelligent, and he's been good to me. We have our differences, and I'll comment on them shortly. And about RJ, it would be imprudent for me to comment on the quality of a colleague, except to say that I made him the dean of something that's been dear to my heart for more than 20 years now, and I do not regret it at all. I'll say a little bit about what my book says right at the end, just briefly, because they've all talked about it, and the book, as you've learned, is short. You can read it if you want to. But about what they've said, I'll say two main things to Randy and then a couple to Professor Deneen. First rights, then government is correct. But it's also correct to say rights and government. Human beings are political animals. They always live under law. The nature of them, it comes from the fact that they can talk. And this is recognized in the Declaration of Independence. They say that we may throw off the government, and then we institute new government. So the conjunction and then I make something out of Joseph Ellis, who was invited to be here today and had to cancel, and I don't know him, but I admire him a lot and I like his work. But Lord, doesn't he say in one of his books on the founding that the Declaration of Independence treats government as an alien force, whereas the Constitution does not, whereas the charges against the king dwell upon the fact that he has thwarted government, beginning with the first of the charges against the king. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. The public good cannot be served except under a regime of law. And that is as recognized in the American founding as it is in the pages of Aristotle, and I don't think that there's any exception to it. John Locke is not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence must be read as a document, and remember the situation in which the Declaration of Independence is written. It is written in an atmosphere of the threat of execution. There is a warrant out for the arrest of everyone who signed that document. And the warrant is not given to a lawful civil officer, it is given to a general. And his army, he's told to use his army and find these men, even if it causes a general conflagration. And so what they say in the document, they thought carefully about it. Jefferson was chosen because everybody knew he could write and knew he had the ideas, and he was young. So don't forget that every human society of which we have any written record lives under laws, and the people who founded the United States of America knew that thing. These laws must operate. Now, if you read Randy's work, which I just told you I do with great profit all the time, he has a wonderful way of describing, of working out how it is, this is my second point about consent, how it is consent actually works practically, although he says, and in a literal fact he's right, we don't really consent to our government. Well, then why should we have it? And his answer in his works is, and if I get it wrong, you can fix it. His answer is, yeah, okay, but broadly we do, and it protects our rights, and our rights are in our nature. And that word nature, you just won't be able to end up using that word nature for very long unless you come to mean two things by it. And one is the thing itself, what makes it what it is. if we brought a pig in this room, all the differences among all the people in this room would diminish in importance, and everybody would turn and say, what's that pig doing in here? There's a great story about that. You know, they put a pig on, somebody took a pig on U.S. Air, Philadelphia to San Francisco, as the therapeutic pet companion. I talk about that in my book. The name of the pig was Charlotte. And the pig misbehaved terribly. There wasn't just the bathroom habits of the pig, there was the snout up the women's dresses. And you know, you can eat the pig, and you cannot eat the human, right? And that distinction in nature, that's what that word means, but also that word nature means the process of begetting and growth by which people come to be, any living thing, right? So our nature includes our families, the way of our birth, all of that. Now, that is a good place for me to turn to Professor Dineen, because he first of all, he's right about a lot of that, just not the main things, in my opinion. And he raises, understand, and see, he does it, by the way, with such a good, you know, thank God he's doing it. He's raising in a very intelligent way the question whether the founding of the United States of America was a good thing. And by the founding, I mean the legal acts that brought it into being, the big things that happened. And, you know, those things happened, and those things have changed the world in a big way, and he's raising the question whether that's good or not. And his key point is that it's a break with antiquity. And you have to reply to that, and the break with antiquity has to do with the fact that now there's a universal principle operating, and that works as some kind of solvent, I think he writes somewhere, that undoes the family and our religious connections. Well, first of all, I don't think the break with antiquity is so great as he does, because you can't get away from the idea that there are natural rights in, for example, Aristotle, about whom I happen to know something. If you read his discussion of slavery in Book 1 of the Politics, on the one hand, he does say that slavery is not going to go away. Although, he says, if the shuttle could weave or the plectrum strike of itself, in other words, if you had technology to do the work, then you wouldn't enslave people. On the other hand, slavery is only right in the case of the incapacitated person. That means if somebody is unable to guide themselves, as every human being and the overwhelming majority of human beings can, only in that case is it right. And so in the ancient world, there's a contradiction, right? It's not perfect. Then a big change. But you can't get away from the fact that the idea that there's a justice that stands outside the will of any of us, that has something to do with the right way to teach, to treat a human being, the nature of the human being. Now, there is a difference between the United States and its founding and the ancient world. But that difference has something to do with a much greater revolutionary than anything that happened in the American Revolution. And that is, Jesus Christ happens between the ancient world and the modern world. And Jesus Christ is an incredible revolutionary. And by the way, the changes that he made are not dissimilar from the changes to which Professor Deneen objects against the United States. Because what does he do except make our salvation the work of each individual one of us and overturn the law and the sense of community in the Mosaic world in the Old Testament and make the religion universal and beyond the boundaries of countries. And by the way, I think that's a great thing. I mean, it's a radical understatement to say that I think that's a great thing. I think that's part of the providential plan for all of the universe. And I think, by the way, the Jewish experience is a step on the way to that. I say that with respect to Jewish people, of which we have many at our college. And so I think that's a great thing, but you have to understand that changes something about politics, something big, because now, all of a sudden, religion and the law are not the same thing anymore. If the Maker says, my kingdom is not of this world, then that means that all of a sudden we're going to make our own laws. And those laws, by the way, are going to have to be limited if there's going to be the freedom to practice one's faith regardless what country he lives in. So that's a change. That's a huge change from the ancient world. And how are we going to cope with that? Is it true that the founders of the United States meant to destroy the family, for example, in local communities? As a matter of fact, what they did, you can read the works of Tom West to find that out, is they strengthened the laws that governed the family. Divorce got harder after the American Revolution than it was before. And then, in addition, you can say that it's true that at the federal level, they don't say much about the family. That's a fact. They don't. But by the way, the things that Jesus himself says about the family are ambiguous. Now, I think I know what they mean. I think, by the way, that Jesus did the same thing that the founders did. I think that he added protections over those that existed in the Mosaic Law. But that's not uniformly what he says. I shall turn father against son, mother against daughter. Is that the quote? It's not the only quote or the meaning of the quotes, except to say that one is facing an eternal world that's beyond anything in this world. Now, lest I be accused of a blasphemy that I compare the founding to the work of Jesus, I actually regard it as obedient to that work. That's what I mean. I submit to this audience, as I do in my book, that the Declaration of Independence has these features. That it is, first of all, a constitutional document. It requires a form of rule, and that form of rule is derived from the nature of the human being, which, by the way, does not deny that the human being is educable. In fact, it constructs a system, the purpose of which is to make, for example, Madison says, in the 51st Federalist, which Professor Dineen quoted extensively, he says that thing about government and the difference between men and angels, right? Well, obviously that quote doesn't assert that angels are ungoverned. It means that they're not subject to human government, because God's governance of the universe is written into the fabric of the Declaration of Independence with the 4 mentions of God, 3 of them as branches of government. The lesson being obvious. He's the maker of the laws of nature and nature's God. He's divine providence, and he's the supreme judge of the world. And the obvious meaning of those 3 things is, if God were ruling us directly, instead of leaving us free from that governance, then you could combine all the powers of government in one set of hands. And that, by the way, that quote about men and angels is a direct reference back to that structure, and we have to remember that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were the closest of friends, including at this time. So I believe that it's a constitutional document and that it looks to the improvement of man. Else, Madison could not make the point throughout the Federalist that one of the things that's going to happen is speech is going to become more candid and honest after the Constitution, because we're going to have to talk across a wider scope about the things that are national, although the things that are local will remain local. Thank God for it. I submit that the Declaration and the Constitution of the United States are both reverential documents. They both look up to God in their structure and in the justifications that were given for them, especially the Declaration, where it is, by the way, explicit in the text and throughout the text. And because they are reverential, I submit that they are acts of obedience. Not revolution. They are obedience to the laws of nature and of nature's God. And I think that because they have these qualities, they are exactly the thing that is required for the world after the birth of Jesus Christ, which has changed so much from antiquity. And I believe, by the way, that most of the modern attempts to recover the ancient practices of community are in fact romantic in their nature. They are an attempt to recreate a thing on a different basis, and generally, although certainly not in the case of Professor Deneen, upon a scientific basis. And that is dangerous, and that is characteristic of progressivism, from which the founders of America are sharply and overwhelmingly distinguished. And by the way, so clearly so, that all you have to do is come with me this afternoon and ride your bicycle about town and look at the buildings, and you will see the difference between the works that they have wrought. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to our panel for the presentations. I think I'll allow some time for some intra-panel questions, if there are any. Professor Barnett?
Thanks very much. I have a couple of responses or additional points I want to make. First, with respect to what Larry said about the consent of the governed, it's true that in my book I point out that we're never really asked for our consent of the government. Consent in that sense is a fiction. The kind of consent you do have to enter into a contract, we never have to manifest to our government. And that's a problem. That's a problem. And I do think one way of reconciling the consent of the governed, which is in the Declaration, with the first part of that sentence, which has to do with to secure these rights, is to first of all acknowledge that problem, realize that the only consent that could possibly be claimed for government is what you might call hypothetical consent, or what they called at the time theoretical or presumed consent. And if you're only going to operate on the basis of presumed consent, then as Locke tells us, no one can be presumed to have left the state of nature to enter into civil society except to make themselves better off. It's the only reason why they could ever have done that. And you would not be better off if you gave up all your rights. The only reason to leave the state of nature is to make yourself better off with respect to securing your rights. And that's the reason why the fact that we're not asked for our consent, and our consent can only be presumed, is the reason why the government, even under this Constitution, is not authorized to violate our fundamental rights, unless there's an expressed statement in there that says they can do something like that, in which case then we can't object on positive law grounds. But you'll find remarkably few statements like that in the Constitution that even are arguably rights violating, until perhaps we got to the Income Tax Amendment. So that's the first thing I would say about consent. Now, I want to say a word about Patrick's point about the fact that the founding represents a break from the past, a break from antiquity. I think in some respects it does, and in a way that I would be in favor of, rather than one that I'd be opposed to. When I was an undergraduate, I became very much influenced by my professor, Henry Veach, who was a very famous Aristotelian Thomist philosopher and Christian. And he became, in a sense, my intellectual mentor. And while I was an undergraduate, I came across the concept of natural rights, reading on my own, which is always a dangerous thing for an undergraduate to do. And I came back to my professor and I said, Henry, I didn't say Henry, it took me years before I could call him Henry. I said, Professor Veach, what about this natural rights stuff? I was very excited. This seems like everything you've been telling us. And he said, no, that natural rights, that's a modern thing. That's something you got to be really. That's not so good. I could tell. He was very diplomatic. He was a very grandfatherly-like character. He did not reproach me, but I felt like, oh, wait a second. I just stepped in something I didn't realize I'd stepped in. That's when I learned that the natural law tradition is not always hospitable to the natural rights that came about during the Enlightenment period. This was a very good lesson to me. Interestingly enough, by the time before he passed away, Henry, under the influence of some philosophers who are libertarian inclined, he actually was induced to change his mind, and he wrote, his last book was called Human Rights, Fact or Fancy, in which he argued there was such a thing as natural rights on natural law grounds, which I thought was an interesting thing for him to do. It wasn't under my influence. I wish I could claim credit. So in a way, yes, natural rights was a modern invention, modern development. It's an Enlightenment development. It's one that our founding is based on. But I also think it actually is not completely discontinuous with the past. In a way that Larry already alluded to with respect to Aristotle, I want to allude to it with respect to Thomas Aquinas himself. By just reading you a passage from question 96 of the Summa Theologica, which has to do with the power of human law, and should human law repress all vices. And in here, I think you're not going to see a natural rights position, but you'll see the seeds of a natural rights position here. And here's what Thomas says in answer to the question, should human law repress all vices? Now, human law is framed for a number of human beings, the majority of whom are not perfect in virtue. Wherefore, human laws do not forbid all vices, from which it is possible for the majority to abstain, and chiefly those that are to the hurt of others. They should only forbid those to the hurt of others, without the prohibition of which human society could not be maintained. Thus, human law prohibits murder, theft, and such like. In fact, the very crimes I became a Cook County State's Attorney to prosecute, murder, theft, and such like. So, yeah, a lot of such like in Chicago, but there was plenty of murder and theft too. So, what he's suggesting here is that human law should basically focus on those things that are of harm to others. Now, this is just a nascent thought, but you can see the seeds are here. It is not the province of human law to make everybody virtuous, although it's, he says, obviously to encourage virtue. And this is in a sense what the natural rights tradition builds upon, and that is that the natural rights tradition is answering a different question than the natural law tradition. The natural law ethics tradition is answering. And this is the last point I'll make, RJ. The natural law ethics position is answering the question, how should we live our life? And I'm still a natural law ethics person for that reason. I think that's the best way of going about thinking about how we should live our life. That's what Henry was teaching me all those years ago. That's what natural law is about. Natural rights is actually using the same methodology to answer a different question. And the different question is, how should society be structured so that people can live their lives? That's a substantially different question than how should we live our life. And to try to run one into the other, I think, is to make a category mistake, and it's actually to lead to really bad stuff. It can, the idea, if human government is there to tell us how to live our lives, that could actually lead to a very bad state of affairs. So it's very important to distinguish between the issue of how we live our life, according to our natures, and the issue of how society should be structured so as to allow us and permit us and facilitate us to live our life according to our natures. And the answer to the second question is the natural rights answer, and that's the answer that the founders had, and that's the answer on which both the Declaration and the Constitution depend.
Thank you, Randy. I think
just very quickly, I want to thank Dr. Arnn, especially for his thoughtful response. One of the great, I think, descriptions of conservatives is they all share one fundamental belief that at some point in the past, something went very wrong. But we disagree bitterly about what that date was. I want to just, I guess, for the record, agree. I hope that it wasn't understood that I was arguing that the founders either explicitly or implicitly or surreptitiously had a grand plan to undermine the family, community, church, etc., and would be delighted by what they saw today. I don't think that for a moment. What I do hope I was able to at least suggest is that there were some fundamental, let's say, philosophical assumptions that have acted, and I think the word solvent was used, and that's the word I would use, has acted like a solvent over a long period of time on a certain set of fundamental commitments that I think in drawing on this older tradition that were understood to be in some ways natural to us and constitutive of who we are, that we are not born, that we are not created as autonomous individuals who simply and always consent to our relationships, but we are rather born into a fabric, into a narrative, into a tradition, that we are constituted by our past as much as we constitute aspects of our future. And it's that narrative of self-creation that begins with Locke or Hobbes' idea of the state of nature, that we are always and everywhere in some ways, if not literally consenting, that idea is in some ways the normative idea that motivates how we think about a relationship, not only to government, but as Locke suggests in some of the chapters in the second treatise on government, to things like our families, where he writes that who we are, and what our relationship to our parents will be, and what our relationship ultimately to our children will be the same consequence of consent as that's acted in the state of nature. And when all human relationships are subject to this logic, relentless logic of consent and choice, it leads like a solvent to the weakening and eventually even the evaporation of the fundamental and stable basis of those ties. So I want to suggest not that the founders are culpable for what I would regard as many of the pathologies of our modern world, but rather embrace an initiative philosophy that, perhaps unbeknownst and unpredictable by them, have led us to a path that I think many of us would share a sense of lamentation about where we are. And I would only caution us that rather than simply regarding a restoration of our constitutional order as sufficient, that we think hard about what would be necessary to restore the basis, the kind of stability of those relationships that seems to me are fundamentally the basis of what a good society is.
Thank you very much. I will, in a moment here, turn it over for questions. I will, I suppose, take the privilege of the chair I think, offer one observation it might be useful to think about as we consider the distinction between the founders and the progressives and the narrative that Professor Dineen talked about and the possibility that he suggests that there was some complicity in the founding itself in terms of the development of progressivism later. And that is the observation as someone who reads a lot of the progressives. When you read a lot of the progressive intellectuals, John Dewey, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Crowley, people like this, there's a commonality among them, I think, which is very telling, and that is that all of them feel it necessary to spend significant time criticizing the founding. And they find it necessary to do so, they say, because they say there's something there in the founding that is radically different than what we progressives think is necessary for our country under present circumstances. And so if it's the case that there's more of a continuity between the founders and the progressives than some of us might suggest, it would seem to me that the argument has to come up against the fact of what the progressives themselves say. Okay, I will be happy to turn it over to audience questions. You guys, someone has to point them out to me because my eyesight is failing. Front row, right here.
I would like to address Professor Barnett. You made an analogy of an airplane flying to the Constitution. If you violate the Constitution, that as it is being done, as many people believe, that if an airplane loses, a multi-engine airplane loses its engines, and we can limp along, precariously as it would be. Having been in the Air Force and flown, I had a very close friend who flew a British Jaguar, which was a twin-engine jet. And I asked him, I said, while you were flying with the British, was it a fun plane? He said, oh, it's a great plane. And I said, it had two engines. If you lost an engine, could you continue to fly it? He said, all the way to the scene of the accident.
That's good. We're going to let that stand without comment.
I'll be incorporating that into my lectures.
Way back. Back there, yes.
Yes, this is a question for Dr. Arnn. Dr. Arnn, could you combine Dr. Barnett and Dr. Dineen's arguments and argue that submission to natural law secures natural rights and is the fundamental duty of both the government and the citizenry?
I want you to repeat that key phrase. If you do what to natural law and natural rights?
Submission to natural law secures natural rights?
Are you interested in graduate school?
Yeah, because, you know, we have a really good one.
We do.
But I've already got that kid. Well, first of all, I even think, in relation to some of my colleagues here, who've been my teachers for 400 years now, that I don't think that those distinctions are so important if you understand that what's going on in the American Revolution is politics. And so they're not writing treatises, although they're people who've read many. And so what do they think? Do they doubt that it's, that, you know, if you promise a woman to be her husband and take care of her, and she bears your children, you ought to keep the promise? Nobody thought, of course, right? It's only today that we can come up with a doubt about that. And so if that's what you mean by the natural law, natural rights becomes a provision of it. Because should, as Lincoln said, one man pray to a just God to wring the bread from the sweat of other men's faces? That's a provision of natural rights and natural law. And so it seems to me that those things have a way of collapsing. And so now, so I don't think the distinction logically is so important. Now, Brandy brings up a point that's really good, though, and that is, if we're going to have a limited government, there's going to have to be a wide scope for us to operate, and we're going to have really a limited government. And that means you're not going to get arrested for not going to church, you know, which happened in Europe and in some New England towns. And you're not going to be forbidden to vote because you go to the wrong one. And so, and you know, that's, you know, going to church, in my little opinion, is a really good thing, and I wish everybody'd go more. And they could put the football games off till later in the day. Still have them, but you see the point. The point is, you're going to if you're going to have a free country, and you're going to have a free country if you're going to have freedom of religion, then this question of rights is going to be terribly important, and you're not going to do more than you have to do. And then my argument is, then you can let people work things out in their towns. And that, you know, until about 1930, more than 1935, more than 65% of the government of the United States was carried on in economic value terms in cities and towns. And most of the rest was counties and states. And the federal government was a small part of it. And that, I submit, is the constitutional plan. And I'll say one more thing about that then, because we brought up, if you look at what Rome was like when it began to grow and conquer the known world, they were distinguished from their neighbors because they were pious, and they were famous for being especially protective of their women, and their families were very strong. And of course, all you got to do is read about the decline of Rome, and what you find out is they're licentious, they betray their women, violence among the citizen body is much more common, their manners decline terribly. And that's not the first time a civilization has been conquered by such things. And our civilization, if you heard Tom West this morning, may be about to be conquered by such things. But at least in the case of Rome, the fault was not to be found in the Declaration of Independence.
My question is for Professor Dineen. I was wondering if you could elaborate on one of the points you made about a problem possibly in the Constitution of relying mostly on self-interest as the impetus behind human action and ambition counteracting ambition. But obviously there's a problem that the progressives ran into with a utopianist mindset of claiming that we could conquer human nature. So I was just wondering if you had a view of how the founders could have better addressed human nature in the founding rather than just focusing on self-interest. If you could elaborate on that.
You should also consider graduate school. Sorry, I'm just recruiting for Notre Dame here. That's a great question, and I guess when I talk about, and this might all seem very strange to be evoking, so you get a political theory seminar here without even having perhaps wanting that. But one of the things that when I talk about this break from antiquity, I think that the central thing that I'm talking about here, I wouldn't draw as sharp a distinction as Dr. Arnn between the antiquity of at least the philosophical antiquity of Greece and Rome, thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, who exert a very strong influence philosophically over the Christian era. And so I see less of a radical break there than I think does Dr. Arnn. And at the heart of it, what I want to call the anthropology, that's fairly consistent, and indeed I would say fundamentally consistent throughout all those various periods of time, is the idea of a mixed human nature, a mixing of both bestial and divine, if I can put it in those terms. That we have, whether it's in the Greek tradition or in the Christian tradition, we have a great propensity toward either vice or sinfulness, and we have a great capacity for virtue or grace, the capacity to, whether by our own efforts, but ultimately not our own efforts, to achieve a kind of the imitation of Christ, to use the title of a great text. But that these things are combined, and they are an inescapable fact about human beings. And one of the things that it seems to me that all of the great thinkers of antiquity, including an Aristotle and an Aquinas, struggle with is how do you educate, in some ways, shape humans to ascend to the highest capacity of their natures, educate the soul in virtue, while preventing the condition of their falling into the most vicious capacities that they may have. And consistently, these thinkers think that what we're calling government, but that the public world, the very basis of the word Republican, res publica, public things, has a role to play in that. It's not to reach into our souls and tell us how we should live, but it's to cultivate the soil where families can raise their children without fear of them watching the television, and where communities can have a commerce without fears of shops of pornography being opened and claiming the rights of free speech, etc. It's that kind of ground that, for all of the ancients, consistently thought we have this great propensity toward viciousness, but this capacity toward virtue, and it takes great effort in education and effort to cultivate that higher part of our soul. And if I would fault the move in the modern period, it's that each of these traditions we're talking about, the early modern liberal tradition of the founders and the progressive tradition, each take a part of that anthropology. For the founders coming out of the tradition of Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke, they conclude that we are really most fundamentally driven by self-interest, and we must organize our institutions under the assumption that the best we can do is harness that interest. And the progressives say, no, we're not merely that. We can overcome our self-interest. We can become species beings, as Marx says. Or we can become members of the great community, as Dewey says, by transcending our sense of self. And each of them, in some ways, take a piece of that ancient anthropology, consistent with both the ancient thinkers and the Christian thinkers, without the other piece. And so my argument is that, in some ways, if we really want to correct our constitution, our way of life, our regime, it requires first a correction of our anthropology, of our assumption about human nature.
So, a contrast between the founders and the progressives. Remember about the founders that they think they're doing something unprecedented, and that is they're going to base the whole policy of the government, the whole strength and control of the government in the great body of the people, and they claim that's never happened before. And they think that that's because the people can be taught. As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. And you can understand that as a qualification of the argument in Federalist 10 about mechanism. And that argument itself, if you read it carefully, also implies that there is a good to which people will attach themselves, identified as the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. And that's from Federalist 10 directly. And so this adventure experiment, they call it, in America, that's the first time, they claim, that we are going, like the quote that Patrick used at the beginning of his talk from Federalist 1 about, you know, settle for all time, whether societies of men. That means everybody is going to get to choose, and that they're going to, and that a structure is going to be established so they choose well, and that structure is going to rely. It's in the 49th Federalist. It says it is the reason alone of the public that must be placed in control of the government. The passions must be controlled by it. But of course, the well-ordered soul in the classical and the Christian world is a soul in which the reason is in charge of the passions. And that's a direct quote from Madison. And my point is, not that, I'm not making a point about Patrick right now, I'm making a point about the distinction between the founders and the progressives, which is radical. Because remember, the progressive solution to government is to place a new force, a scientifically trained force that's in all these office buildings around here, that is separate from the public and exercises a control on the society.
RJ, could I just say one thing?
Very quickly, please.
Yeah. Here's a fundamental shift between the founding generation and the progressives. Fundamental. The founders thought if you protect these rights, things will work out. The progressives rejected that idea. They said these rights are standing in our way. That's a horse and buggy way of thinking. It's a horse and buggy constitution. They stand in our way. What you need to do is, instead of enforcing those rights and let things work out right, and define the rights right and let things work out right, we've got to take all those rights, we've got to put them in the hands of the experts, and then they're going to figure out how to do public policy, and that's going to make things right along a scientific way. That's a huge fundamental paradigm shift. And we're still living with that paradigm shift. But that's, if you want to boil it down to that, there's a huge difference there that we have to realize that we're resisting, and that what really, I think, what liberals in the classical sense should be for is the reassertion of these rights, and understand by protecting these rights, we will yield better results overall than if we take the rights away and give it to some body of experts or even the majority to say, well, let them yield better results. So which one actually gets the better results? Which one actually yields a society in which you can pursue happiness while achieving peace and prosperity? I think the answer is the protection of those rights is the way, and that's what we have to reaffirm.
Thank you, Professor Barnett, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm afraid we're out of time, and I have been instructed by my superiors that I am to encourage you to clear the room expeditiously, because I believe they're actually setting up our lunch in this room. So we'll see how well that goes. But again, thank you very much.
So you have to come